Please be seated.
Good morning. Ready for the jury? Okay, if you bring the jury.
One thing, this will take a second. If possible, if we could have a 10 or 15-minute break around 11:30, that would be helpful.
Okay.
If it doesn't work that time. We have our office Thanksgiving thing, and I'd like to go tell my people I'm thankful for them.
All right. Reasonable.
I assume I won't object if we're all invited.
Yeah, if y'all like a plate, I'd bring it back. I'm not asking you to go eat with them, but just when they get started.
All right, thank you. Good morning. Good morning. Welcome back. One more day. Defense's case, your next witness.
Please report, William Schneck.
Do you swear affirm the testimony shown to the court and jury in the trial in this case to be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? I do. Please state your first and last name, and spell your last name loud and clearly.
My name is William Schneck. My last name is spelled S-C-H-N-E-C-K.
Good morning, Mr. Schneck.
Good morning.
Can you tell us where you live and work, please?
Yes, I live in Spokane, Washington. I'm the president of Microvision Northwest Forensic Consulting.
And what does forensic consulting do?
Microvision Northwest Forensic Consulting, it's a private firm which I started in 1995, and I'm involved in crime scene reconstructions and trace evidence analysis.
Could you tell us your academic training, please?
Certainly. I have a Bachelor of Science degree in Allied Health Science with a specialty in respiratory therapy. I have a Bachelor of Science degree in Geology from Georgia State University in Atlanta in 1983. I have a Master's of Science degree in Geology from Eastern Washington University in 1986.
Can you tell us what you have done in your field since 1986?
Yes, since 1986, my first professional employment as a as a forensic scientist was at McCrone Associates, a company based out of Chicago with offices in Atlanta. In that facility, I was the coordinator of the materials analysis section, and we looked at reverse engineering building materials that contained asbestos products. What we were doing is identifying the companies that manufactured these products, and the attorneys would therefore be suing companies to remove asbestos from buildings during litigation processes. And during that time frame, we looked at a vast variety of materials, including materials that contained paint, materials that contained wood and metals, and of course, asbestos. That was the first 3 years. In 1990, I moved to Washington State, where I am today, actually, in Spokane, where I worked as a materials scientist there, in which I look at a vast variety of inorganic and organic materials and trace evidence. These things range from paint, building materials, wood, and as a geologist, I look at soil and minerals, asbestos, glass, impression evidence, shoe prints and tire tracks, gastric contents even. Then the crime scene part of my work involves reconstructions, involving trajectory analysis, bloodstain pattern analysis, and trying to put the big picture together in some crimes to determine where people were at certain locations and certain events. But predominantly my work involves microscopy, using a series of different types of microscopes to analyze, identify, and compare particles. So that's from 1990 to the present, working for the State Patrol Crime Laboratory. I am not here testifying on behalf of the State Patrol, but I do work for them full-time. I'm here testifying on behalf of my private business, Microvision Northwest, which I started in 1995, doing essentially the same types of work privately, because many of the laboratories in the Western United States do not have trace evidence employees any longer. So I often work for the prosecution doing trace evidence work in my private laboratory. Also, between 1995 and the present, I started another company called, it's an archaeological services company, in which I'm looking at archaeological items like Indian rock art painting to determine if they are authentic rock art paintings or not, or if they're forgeries. So that, in a nutshell, that's pretty much what I've been doing since 1986 or 87.
In that time, have you produced publications in your field? Have you taught seminars? And if so, just generally what they are and who your audience would be.
Yes, I do quite a bit of training. That's the other part of my business I failed to mention. I do a lot of training around the world, actually. A lot of it is in geology, forensic geology, but it's also in general trace evidence collection and analysis. Some of my clients are the federal government, the FBI, the California Criminalistics Association down in Sacramento and in LA. And I've taught for city, state, and federal government agencies, the police, the sheriff's offices, prosecuting attorneys, defense attorneys throughout the country and in South America and in Europe.
Do you consider yourself a trace evidence expert
Yes, I do.
based on your training and your experience and your work for the state police?
Yes.
And do you consider yourself a crime scene reconstructionist
Yes, I do.
based on your experience, training, etc.?
Correct.
And in that capacity, have you testified in court before?
Yes, I have.
Approximately how many times?
Approximately 150 times over the past 30 years.
Would that be in federal court,
It would be in federal court? Yes.
in state courts?
Correct.
Perhaps the easiest way to ask that, are there any western states that you have not testified in?
I believe Nevada, but predominantly the western states and Arkansas, but I've worked on cases throughout the United States. But testifying, I don't come out to your part of the country that often, although I'd like to.
And is this your first time testifying in South Carolina?
Yes, it is.
Your Honor would offer Mr. Schneck as an expert in trace evidence and crime scene reconstruction.
Who says the state?
Your Honor, with regard to that, certainly recognize him as being an expert in trace analysis and do not object to that, but I don't think foundation has been laid for crime scene.
Would you like to voir dire him on that issue?
Just a couple of questions.
All right.
Good afternoon, Mr. Schneck.
Good afternoon.
Good morning, I should say. Could you just let me know what your experience in terms of crime scene reconstruction is?
Oh, certainly. Yes, through the State Patrol, starting in about 1995, I began going to crime scenes, initially because they wanted some trace evidence analyzed. But over the course of several years, I was involved in more and more of the reconstruction processes. For instance, identifying bloodstain patterns and trajectories, on-the-job training, if you will. Then, over the course of another 10 years, I took probably 5 different 1-week to 2-week workshops in crime scene reconstruction and in trace evidence analysis from people such as Bevel and Gardner, their renowned bloodstain pattern specialists, in which they would come to our state of Washington and put workshops on. And as a member of the crime scene response team for the State Patrol Crime Lab, I was also responsible for training, years later, other newer employees in reconstruction of trace evidence.
And how many of your previous testimony and on how many occasions have you been qualified as an expert in crime scene reconstruction?
I would,
That's the trace out.
certainly, far less. I would say probably about 15 to 20 times, probably. More in the last 5 years than prior to that I've been testifying in crime scene.
Okay, were you engaged in this case more for trace evidence analysis or crime scene reconstruction?
Well, actually, only for trace evidence.
Okay, thank you, sir. I have no further questions.
Thank you.
I have no objection.
He's qualified in both fields.
Mr. Schneck, you've now been declared an expert, and in that capacity, you have testified before, correct?
Yes.
And what, if you know, do you testify for the prosecution or for the defense? Tell us a little bit about who you have testified for in those.
Oh, certainly. Well, working for the state government, for the Washington State Patrol, I typically, in that capacity, represent or testify, I should say, for the prosecution. In my private practice, I testify for the prosecution and the defense. Oftentimes, there are agencies in the western states, as I mentioned earlier, who do not have experts in my area, so I testify for them. But I also testify for the defense, too. I would say 25–30% of my time it's for the defense and the rest for the prosecution, in both criminal and civil litigation matters, too. Not always criminal, but oftentimes I'm hired for other things such as accident reconstructions and that aren't involved criminally.
So if one is called, if a scientist such as yourself is called for one side or the other, how does that affect your testimony?
Well, it really doesn't affect my testimony at all. I'm just looking at the facts in the case. I'm not really on anybody's side. Like I say, I work for the prosecution and the defense. I just look at the evidence, and that leads me to conclusions and opinions on what I'm looking at, usually under a microscope.
Now, in this case, were you engaged by the Savage Law Firm?
Oh, yes, I was.
And tell us what you did as a result of being retained by the Savage Law Firm.
Initially, I was asked to look at a taser because a previous examiner found possible fibers on the taser. And they were blue fibers that he said he found. So he wanted to know if I wanted to be involved in this particular case, and Mr. Savage then called me and retained me to look at fibers on a taser. That was the initial involvement.
And we want to take a look at Defendant's Exhibit 14, please.
Thank you.
You recognize
Yes, I do. I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear.
I was asking them to put it up so the
Oh.
jury can see what you're looking at. As he's scrambling, if you would look at defendant's 14, and it'll come up in just a moment.
Oh, okay.
If you would refer to your photograph. Tell the jury what that is.
Exhibit 14 is a taser, and it's showing the portion of the taser. Oh, here we go.
Actually, we want this defendant's 14, please, Mr. Ackerman. We're looking for exhibit 14, Mr. Ackerman.
Oh, certainly. Excuse me, Your Honor, is there a taser or a pointer at all here? Do you know? Oh, very good.
Is that the this defendant's 14 now that's up before the jury?
Yes, it is.
Sometimes low tech is better.
Sometimes low tech is better.
Would you please tell the jury what your examination of that taser consisted of and what you actually performed?
Certainly. To begin with, I'm not a taser expert by any stretch of the imagination. I don't even own a taser. But I'm an expert in particle analysis. This particular device, I was asked to examine it for fiber evidence, or anything else that could be on the taser, for that matter, that's not manufactured with it. In this particular case, there were fibers on the taser that I removed. And they were located in several locations on the terminals and under and around the terminals. Could I approach the...
Yes.
Thank you. Up in this area, there were a series of fibers and particles which I removed from the taser using a forceps or small tweezers. Of course, before that, I have white examination paper under the taser. And there's also a stereobinocular microscope which is used to magnify that particular taser up to approximately 40 times. And in using that, using a fine little forceps, I removed several fibers and little clumps of material and placed them on Post-it notes. Then folded the Post-it notes in half and retained those with the taser. But also of interest, as you may be able to see on that taser, are some other little marks and damage, because part of one of my subspecialties within trace evidence is damage assessment. And that can be damage assessment often to clothing, but it can be of anything, like car accidents. There's a dent in the side of the car. How did that happen? What could be on it? In this particular case, I'm going to show you some yellow paint transfers, which are located here. You can see the fine little particles of yellow paint, probably, from where you are. And in this area, there's a little gouge in the plastic, a little defect in the plastic here with some yellow paint, a little defect in here too. So at this particular time, although I was asked to look for fibers, I mean, I will look at everything while I'm there, and I did happen to see some yellow paint particles, so I removed those, not knowing if at some point in the future they could be of any significance or not. So at the time I removed the fibers, I also removed yellow paint particles to separate Post-it notes. And they were retained with the evidence when it was examined.
Do you know approximately or exactly when that analysis was done?
Yes, it was done on February 10th of this year.
And do you know where that taser had been before you received it on the West Coast?
Not really, other than the information that was on the box. And, but I don't know its exact location or where it was.
Do you know whether or not it had been photographed or examined before you received it?
I think I do remember it being examined by Taser experts prior to my examination.
And what did you do with the sample of yellow markings? What did you do with them after you removed them from the taser?
Excuse me. They were placed in Post-it notes and retained with the evidence, with the Taser, in separate envelopes.
When you did this examination, was there anyone representing the State Law Enforcement Division of South Carolina present?
Yes.
Was anything done out of their presence?
No.
And what did you do with the exemplar that you took from this taser? Who did you give it to?
I gave it to Rick Wyatt of WD Forensics. And
do you know what he did with it?
yes, during my presence, they were placed back in the box with the Taser.
And did you ever receive that paint exemplar again?
Yes, I did.
And when was that?
Could I refer to my notes for the
Sure.
exact date? Thank you.
You can give us an approximate time frame so that the jury will understand.
It was approximately 10/14 of this year.
That would be October 14th?
Yes, October 14th.
And when you received it, what did you do with it?
Well, when I received the paint from the Taser, I examined it, photographed it, and analyzed it using a series of different microscopes and instruments.
At the time you examined it in the early part of the year, did you have anything to compare the yellow stain to any other exemplar?
No, I did not.
When you received it in October, did you have something to compare it to?
Yes, I did.
And what is the purpose in scene reconstruction or trace evidence? What is the purpose of the examination you performed in October?
Well, it goes back to a French examining magistrate, actually, called Edmond Lecard, over 150 years ago, who came up with this idea that anytime two things come in contact with one another, there's a transfer of evidence. Just like you may have all had fender benders, and you might come out to the parking lot and see your car, and it might be a blue car, and there's white paint on it now. And where'd that come from? Well, that's a transfer of evidence. So anytime two things come in contact, that could occur. So that's the major idea we use in what I do anyway in forensics. Look for that transfer of material, either between people and things, people and people, or things and things.
Did you have an opportunity to come to Charleston, South Carolina, between the time you removed the exemplar from the Taser and the time you examined the paint sample?
Yes.
And did you go to North Charleston, South Carolina at that time?
Yes, I did.
I want to show you defendant's, State's Exhibit 86.
Thank you.
Do you recognize that?
Yes, I do.
And there we have State's 86. Can you tell the jury what that is?
Yes, that's a road from the crime scene that I visited on the evening of the 14th, October 14th.
And tell us what you did there.
While there, although it was in the evening time, I examined that particular road that we see, which I believe it's often been referred to as the Yellow Brick Road. But on that particular road, I wanted to collect some samples of the yellow paint to have it compared, for me to compare it to the yellow paint that I found on the Taser. So while there, being accompanied by 2 investigators, I personally collected 2 different paint samples from that particular road.
When you were in the neighborhood in North Charleston, did you collect any other paint samples?
Yes, I did. Not too far from this particular location, there is a auto parts store and a parking lot there. And there's yellow paint stripes, as there often are in parking lots. So I wanted to collect the control paint from one of the stripes too, because that was in the vicinity of the, what I understand, the crime scene area.
After you collected those exemplars, did you return to Spokane?
Yes, I did.
And what did you do in Spokane with those samples?
Well, in Spokane, I examined the known paints using a series of microscopes. First of all, it will visually examine the known paints separately on white paper with exam gloves and a lab coat, and wanted to get an idea of what they visually looked like and microscopically looked like. So I used a stereo microscope, enlarges the particles up to about 100 times. And then they were picked off, little fragments of the known paint were picked off onto microscope slides. And they were put in a special mounting media. It's a kind of an oily fluid. And a little piece of cover glass is placed over the top of it and disperses the particles around the slide so they're not all clumped up on one another. And then a microscope called a polarizing light microscope that are used by forensic scientists and geologists that transmits light through the specimen so you can actually see the internal structure of particles if they're translucent or transparent, which they are in paints. So I did that. I examined the paints, identified the pigments and the filler ingredients, and took a series of photographs, notes. And then the next step was to take that same control paint and use this. 2 other tests were employed. One's called a test with another kind of microscope called a scanning electron microscope, SEM for short. In that microscope, the samples are placed on little stubs. And they are then examined with this electron beam that shoots down onto the sample and produces an image of it, sort of like what you saw on the old TV sets years ago, cathode ray tube. And it'd be flicking back and forth, and you can see a 3-dimensional image of this paint chip. Well, that's great. You can see what it looks like from the outside, and you can determine it's a single-layered paint. So the paints from the road were single-layered, they weren't multiple layers. And there's a detector, it's called, that's connected to this SEM. It comes into the side of it. And what this detector does, it tells us the elements that are composed of the particles. So for instance, calcite, which was one of the components in the sample, and that has calcium in it. Well, this detector will have a series of peaks. Sort of like if you've ever seen a medical show like EKG spectrum, where it has the different up and down things. Well, each one of those peaks represents an element, or a series of elements. And from that, you can determine what some of the chemistry of the sample. So that's what that's used for. Then there's one more test. It's called infrared spectroscopy. Well, that's another fancy name for how the vibration of energy travels through a sample. And this particular instrument will tell us more of the organic and inorganic nature of the samples. So that was employed. So then we compared these control paints from the yellow brick road and the parking lot stripe sample to the sample on the Taser to look for similarities or differences.
Can I interrupt you just for a moment?
Certainly.
Could I-
I would submit this as Defendant's Exhibit 62 in evidence.
Thank you.
If you would refer to those photographs, if you can call them out so the gentleman running the video can keep up with you as you progress through your studies, you may refer to those photographs.
Okay, thank you. Okay, if we could examine figures 1 and 2. During my visit to the scene, these are some of the photographs that I took, and you can see I have markers there labeled 1 on the left and 2 on the right. Those are the sample numbers. So then I picked off some of the yellow paint, and the yellow paint's actually on like an asphalt driveway that's been painted over with a roller apparently. So I picked off little pieces of gravel with the paint connected to it. And those were placed in 2 separate envelopes labeled 1 and 2. And if we could go to figures 3 and 4, the upper left image, again, this is in my laboratory. And there's a scale below image on the upper left, which is in millimeters, showing the gravel from the road with the paint connected to it or attached to it. And from that, you can see its yellow color. But it's difficult from there to actually determine if there's 1 layer, 2 layers, or 15 layers. The image on the right is of a scanning electron micrograph of the same paint on the left. And because we're using electrons instead of photons, everything's in black and white. But from that, if I can approach the slide, I will show you it's a single layered sample. So the cross section of the paint starts right here to here. And there's no differences when you look at that layer. If there'd be more than 1 layer, you'd see demarcations or lines between layers like pages of a book. And there's none there. And this is just the top surface of it because the chip is sitting at a little bit of an angle, so you're not getting a direct cross-sectional view.
Mr. Schneck, could I ask you in layman's terms what that means is that the location was painted 1 time?
Yes, it was painted 1 time. If it was painted twice, you'd probably, well, you would see 2 layers. And 3 times, 3 layers. And the bottom left-hand photograph is location number 2. Now, the reason that I collected 2 samples is I wanted to see if there were differences in the paint on that road. Because I didn't want to pick 1 sample, then find out there'd be a different paint 20 feet away. So I usually collect at least 2 samples. If we could go to figure 5 and 6. Okay, my figure on the left is when I visited the crime scene. It was at night, and it's lit by car lights. And it doesn't look as yellow when the bright lights of the car are on the road, but you saw the previous image where it looked indeed yellow. L1 up on the left-hand side. This is the location I collected the first sample, L1. And this was taken from that location because of the investigators saying this is the approximate location where the 2 individuals were together at one time. Location 2 is just a little bit off the field of view, but it's on the other side of the road just to get another control sample. Now the image on the right in the different location, that's where location 3, that's the parking lot stripe, which is around the corner. Excuse me if I could get up one more time. I believe it's around the corner. If you could go down and to the left. There's I think it's, I forgot the name, it might be Advanced Auto Parts, I'm not sure. But there's a parking lot stalls in there, and that's where I collected the multi-layered yellow paint. We could actually go to figure 10 and 11. Figure 10 on the left, that's the multi-layered paint from that parking lot stripe. And again, now you can start to see differences. It's not a single layer, it's multiple layers, indicating that that stripe was painted at least 5 or 6 times. And I think that's self-evident, particularly on the left one. The bottom layer is red, and all the other ones are yellow. You can even see differences in the yellow, in the color and the texture. And the image on the right is of that same paint chip using that electron microscope. And the contrast in the little particles indicates compositional differences in the sample, like some are calcite grains and some are particles of titanium dioxide. Then if we could go to figure 7. This is the control paint before it was cross-sectioned from that parking lot stripe. The image on the far left is the reverse side showing the red paint, and all the other ones show the top surface. As you can see, it's rather oxidized and darkened in color from just environmental contaminants and cars driving over it. Then if we could go to figure 9. Now the test with that polarizing light microscope where I place some of the paint chips onto a slide, of course this is not a very attractive image, but to a microscopist this tells us a lot. Now that's looking through the sample, and on the left side it's in a showing the grains or the little pigment particles in the sample. And the right side, it's in another optical configuration with the microscope, in polarized light they call it, which helps us identify some of the ingredients. So I'm not going to show figure 1 or the location 1 because it looks just like location 2. So location 1 and 2 were identical in composition and color and texture. So therefore, I was able to determine that locations 1 and 2 are the same from the road, yellow brick road, and location 3, that stripe, which was different in composition. So I could tell the difference between the yellow brick road and the parking lot stripe. Well, that's important, because I needed to know if there's differences out there. And that's essentially what I did on the Taser paints and the paint from the road.
What conclusion did you reach from your examination of the Taser and the paint exemplars you took from Yellow Brick Road?
Yes. On the Taser, there were several locations with yellow paint. And it's very tedious and time-consuming to examine every single speck of yellow paint on anything. So of the 2 envelopes from the Taser, there were yellow paints. I examined both of them visually and with the stereo microscope, but I only went further with additional tests on one of those 2 samples. And I was able to determine that the paint on the Taser is similar and consistent with the paint from the yellow brick road, but dissimilar and not from the paint on that stripe from the parking lot, parking lot stripe.
And was there damage in the location, was there damage to the Taser in the location in which the exemplars that matched the yellow brick road were found?
Yes, there were some defects and scratches associated with the yellow paint on the Taser.
Now, did you have an occasion when you were in Charleston to go to the prosecutor's office?
Yes, I did.
And who did you meet with there?
I met with the Solicitor General, and I met with approximately 10 other people in a conference room.
And what did you do in the conference room?
In the conference room, I had the opportunity to examine a cellular telephone, an LG cellular telephone.
And who provided that cell phone to you?
The Solicitor General's office.
And what did you do with the cellular telephone?
I was asked to examine this cellular telephone because previously I was told there may be some yellow particles adhering to the phone. So I flew from Spokane to Charleston and examined the phone in their office on white paper using exam gloves. And I did notice there was damage to the cell phone and to the glass, which was broken, cracked I should say, and damage to the surfaces and the edges of the phone. And I collected what I saw on the phone was yellow paint in various locations, and I collected yellow paint from the phone.
And that was all in the presence of the state's investigators and prosecutors, is that correct?
Yes, there were prosecutors there. There is an investigator from SLED. That's an acronym for I think you may know what that is. I'm not even sure the acronym's totality in its name, South Carolina Law Enforcement Organization. And there were people from the crime laboratory there, Megan Fletcher. She was the same lady that came out to Seattle to watch me work. And a director of the crime laboratory and a manager and quite a few other attorneys.
And what did you do with the exemplars, the samples you took from the cell phone?
After they were collected, I actually packaged them myself and took them back with me to my own laboratory in Spokane to examine.
With reference to both the cell phone and the taser, did you leave sufficient paint samples on those instruments for anyone else who may have wanted to test those samples?
Yes, there were approximately 4 major locations of yellow paint, and I collected paint from 3 out of 4 of those locations, left one alone so I could be examined by someone else.
And tell us, do you have a photograph of the cell telephone?
Yes, I do.
Would you kindly show that to the jury and point out the damage to the cell phone and the location of the paint exemplars you took?
Certainly, it would be figure 12. My figure 12 shows locations labeled A, B, C, and D. Location A, that's pretty much the bottom of the cell phone. If you were to hold it, it would be on the lower left-hand corner with the screen facing you, or the viewer. And I have some larger magnified images I will show you next. But for now, you can barely see from where you are possibly, some yellow paint damage, and also fractures into the glass. Location B, there's another location. It's hard, you really can't see it well from this view, but we'll see it. It's also broken. The screen is broken. There's a divot or a little defect in the plastic, and there's some paint associated with it. And there's some other large fractures that actually look like they come from this location. The way they're cracked, fractured, broken. I also examine glass too as one of my specialties. Location C and D also contain paint chips, or paint smears, not chips, paint smears, excuse me, at that location. If we could move on to figure 13. Again, this is the bottom of the phone, bottom edge of the phone. Location A is an area. And you can see a series of yellow paint smears. Now there's a difference between a paint chip and a paint smear. Smear is where it comes across something and rubs across it and smears the paint. Where a chip would be like a car paint chip where it flicks off, or a wall paint where a little piece breaks off and it's real brittle. In this case, it's smeared and impacted. But with this, you can see a series of paint damage and associated little breaks into the plastic, and the little fracture marks that you can see across the glass. Location B is another sampling location, which I picked. But also, other areas that have yellow paint, I didn't collect every single fragment of yellow paint on the phone. There's even some yellow paint in this defect. You can see how it's crushed in there. And if you remember from the photograph of the road, it was kind of a gravelly surface. So if this phone were to contact the road, for instance, with any force, it might leave a defect with some yellow paint adhering to it. And again, you can see the fractures starting from this area, which cracked the glass.
Mr. Schnecht, I understand part of your training and experience has been in glass. Is that correct?
Correct.
Could you provide the jury with your opinion as to the timing of the cracking of the glass and the smearing of the yellow paint?
Well, in my opinion, they occurred pretty much at the same time. Contemporaneously is kind of a big word, but at the same time, same event, because the yellow paint is often into the divot, if I could show you this. That yellow paint is associated with a defect, which I believe could be a fragment of the gravel surface of the road.
Did you leave the cell phone with the prosecutor?
Yes, I did.
And did you return to Spokane?
Yes.
Is it Spokane or Spokane?
Spokane,
So you returned to Spokane where your laboratory is,
correct.
and tell the jury what you did there.
Well, in the laboratory, now I have 3 paint samples. I collected locations A and B, and if we could go to figure 14, location C. So I collected A, B, and C, and left location D. I didn't collect it from D. So when I went to my laboratory then, oh, could we look at figure 15 too? This is another image, a close-up image of the of location A. And again, you can see the yellow paint in contact with the glass and corner as it cracked. So in my laboratory, I performed the same tests as I did on the yellow brick road and the sample from the parking lot stripe. Stereo microscopy, looking at the color similarities. I looked at polarizing light microscopy, looking at the pigments and the filler ingredients in the paint. A scanning electron microscopy to look at, make sure it's not a layered paint. It's a single layered paint, and again, identifying the elements in the paint. Then infrared spectroscopy, identifying the, another method of identifying the composition. So the same tests were performed. Unfortunately, couldn't do all of the tests with every sample because of the sample size, but at least 2 to 3 of each one of those tests was performed, which is enough for me to base my opinions on the samples. In figure 16, again, in the laboratory, these are some of the scrapings that I removed from the cell phone at location A when I was at the Solicitor General's office. And that scales in millimeters to show you the size. And what we see here is the yellow paint adhering to the plastic of the cell phone. And the plastic cell phone is the dark colored material. And the yellow is the paint on the surface of the cell phone. So that was picked off with tungsten wires and needles, very fine, sharp devices, and placed on microscope slides and to be examined further. Figure 17, if we could look at that one. We saw images similar to this earlier when we looked at some samples from the road. But this shows the paint location A. On the left is what's called plain polarized light microscopy image. Again, looking at the fine little pigment grains. And the images on the right is pretty much the same location using a different format in the microscope to show us the structures and optics of the particles. So in which case, that's the same methods were used to identify the paint on the Taser and compare it to the paint on the cell phone and the road and the parking lot.
Did you then reach a conclusion as to the paint on the cell phone and those locations you described, the source of that paint?
Yes, locations on the bottom of the cell phone, the bottom left and the bottom right, locations A and B, they were microscopically and chemically similar to the paint from the yellow brick road, just as they were with the Taser. And there was particle on the upper left hand of the phone, interestingly enough, was dissimilar to the paint from the yellow brick road because it had an element chromium in it. So because of the presence of that one element, in my opinion, it was a dissimilar paint. Even though these paints have some surface contaminants from the highway and being out in the environment, I still found it enough to eliminate one of the paints. But I could include paints from the bottom of the phone and the Taser as originating from the yellow brick road, or another paint identical to it, which could be found somewhere else. But I have, you could go or travel the world and look at paints, but I traveled the parking lot and that parking lot stripe.
And would it be your opinion then where the damage occurred, the damage to the phone that you've described in the glass occurred?
I didn't quite understand. I have a little problem hearing my lip right ear.
So the photograph that's up there now, figure 13, shows 2 different structural defects on the cell phone glass.
Yes.
And do you have an opinion as to where that happened? Where was the phone when it was received that damage?
When it received that damage, it could very well have been on the yellow brick road because the paints were identical in chemistry.
Give me just one moment. I want to show you State's Exhibit 35.
Yes.
And can you tell us what that is?
Yes, this is the same telephone that I examined in the Solicitor General's office.
And did they tell you that who owned that phone?
Yes, I've been told it's Walter Scott's phone.
One moment, please. Thank you, Mr. Sheriff, and kindly answer any questions that possibly may.
Thank you.
By the state.
Mr. Schnapp, hope you enjoy your trip to Charles.
Oh, thank you, I am very much.
You may step down, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll have you step out now while he's preparing to leave. Please do not discuss the case. We'll take a few minutes.